Join us now for Education Matters, a weekly look at the real people and real stories in education across North Carolina.
Welcome to Education Matters, presented by the Public School Forum of North Carolina. I'm Keith Poston. African American students are being suspended at rates 3 to 4 times higher than other students in school districts across North Carolina. The latest evidence released just last week by Wake County Public Schools, where African Americans represent less than a quarter of the student population, but account for almost 2/3 of all suspensions. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the data and ask our guests why this is happening and what can be done to address it. Before we tackle our main topic, we open with our headlines, a quick scan of education headlines across North Carolina and the U.S. House Bill 90 became law last week, 30 days after the General Assembly passed it. The bill pushes out the K-3 class size mandate by 4 years and provides separate funding for art, music, and PE teachers whose jobs had been at risk due to the mandate. Governor Cooper did not sign the bill due to his objections to non-education additions to the bill, including changes to the composition of the state elections board, but allowed the bill to become law without his signature. Just 2 weeks after committee leaders downplayed the likelihood of breaking up large school districts like Wake and Mecklenburg, a legislative study committee met last week for several hours exploring precisely that, hearing from experts on potential legal hurdles and financial impacts. Proponents of breaking up school districts say smaller ones will be more responsive to local communities, while opponents say it will be costly and lead to resegregation. Finally, school safety remains in the spotlight a month after the shooting at a high school in Parkland, Florida. Last week, a joint legislative committee here in North Carolina heard a presentation on how teachers could be trained to handle firearms. This week, a new North Carolina House Select Committee on School Safety, created by House Speaker Tim Moore, holds its first meeting. It is expected to focus primarily on mental health and school security infrastructure. And this Saturday, tens of thousands of students, including many from North Carolina, are expected to descend upon Washington, D.C. for the March for Our Lives that is calling for, among other things, tougher gun laws as a way to prevent mass shootings. Remember, you can visit the Public School Forum's website at ncforum.org and read more about each of the headlines as well as the other topics we cover each week. Last week, the Wake County Public School System released new data on student suspensions in 2016-2017. This came after a request from the Wake County Board of Education for more information on the high number of elementary school suspensions, and we're actually joined by one of those Wake County Board of Education members today. Keith Sutton, Wake County Board of Education, been on the board for 9 years. Before that, Keith had held leadership positions with the North Carolina NAACP and the Triangle Urban League. So, known you for a few years. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Dr. Keisha Bentley Edwards. We just met just a couple weeks ago. Dr. Bentley Edwards is at Duke University, a team that is actually still playing in March Madness. She is with the Samuel D. Cook Center on Social Equity. So she's a professor and a researcher and has some experience and expertise in this issue of disparities and racial equity. So I want to start with the data. I'm going to pull up a couple of screens. I want to start with you, Keith, as we talk about it. The numbers were pretty stark. I mean, we're looking at there were 12,000 suspensions in Wake County public schools in 2016, 2017. 20% of them were in elementary schools. African Americans are about a quarter of the student population, but are 2/3 of the suspensions I mentioned. And this was for the elementary school. 61% of elementary school students suspended were black children in the 4th and 5th grade. Now we've also got another chart that sort of breaks it down and shows you the actual disparity. As you see the dark blue pie chart, again showing this is just elementary school suspensions in Wake County. This is pretty indisputable evidence that there are pretty significant disparities in Wake County in terms of how students are suspended and treated in the discipline. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it is. We have known for some time that there is a disproportionate number of African American students are being suspended. While it represents a very small number of elementary students, roughly 2% of the students in elementary school, just again, the difference in the rate of black students versus white and other races is extremely high, and we feel like it's at a crisis point in the district, and we need to respond to it, figure out why that is, and then how we respond to it.
And I mean, and we're focusing on elementary school, but I mean, the research we've done at the Public School Forum, and we're going to show some other data in a minute from some other districts. Obviously, this is something, as a school board member now for 9 years, and you served as chair. This obviously flows across all the middle school, high school too, right?
And this is not unique to elementary levels. This is not unique to Wake County. This is not unique to North Carolina.
Right.
We see the same or similar disproportionality in terms of suspensions across the board.
Yeah, one thing I do, Dr. Bentley Edwards, I read an article you wrote recently, and it actually, you highlight the fact that you start seeing this show up in preschool.
Absolutely. On a national level, and this is looking specifically at pre-K programs that are part of a state system or a county system, because the private preschools, we don't have those numbers. But the disparities are similar to what you see here, and you have to wonder, what does a toddler have to do to get suspended or expelled?
Right.
And that's the way you have to look at it from a developmental perspective. And that's why when you have school psychologists, you often see a lower number, an active, regularly placed school psychologist or behavioral specialist, because they're able to make the distinctions between what's normal behavior that can be modified or where you can change the teacher approach,
Right.
compared to what needs more in-depth study and care as far as that child. And that's why you have less suspensions and expulsions when you have specialists that are there to help make proper interventions.
Right. Let me show up just so we can, because I want to continue the conversation into sort of what do we do? I mean, what are some solutions? But let's look at Guilford County and Mecklenburg County. We've got some charts here, just as to your point out. Wake County is just the most recent, and frankly, I give a lot of credit to Guilford and Charlotte-Mecklenburg for putting this data out. They actually released some pretty extensive equity reports. Guilford, you had the much higher number of instructional days lost, which, you know, when we get right down to it, that's part of the problem here, is just losing. And then there you can see the bar charts in the middle, and we'll have these on our website too, just showing you the significant disproportion between black, white students and Hispanic. I mean, it's striking. Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, we've got the data for them too. You know, in all grade spans, the percentage of black students with one or more suspensions is substantially higher than every other race. And the one thing that I thought was interesting, because we often hear about achievement gaps and things like this, that it's poverty, but we can show up the next slide. Charlotte-Mecklenburg put it out and showed, all right, well, here are students from high poverty, moderate poverty, and low poverty, and we still have the same gaps. You have the same gaps. In fact, you can even see that, like, sort of a low poverty African American students, you're still going to be suspended even disproportionately to sort of a low wealth white student. So we got the data. So what do we do? I mean, it's I guess recognizing the problem is the first step, but now sort of what are the things that we should be thinking about, and why is it happening?
Well, I think recognizing the problem certainly is the first step. That's why we, have this data. We're analyzing this data and seeing what others are doing, and then understanding why this problem exists. And as you talked about, race, poverty obviously have some impact on that. But what happens in the classroom, as Dr. Bingley Edwards just spoke about, in terms of how teachers and staff respond to that, so having the proper number of counselors and social workers in our schools, having teachers understand about childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and being well positioned and trained to deal with that as they see that happening in children, particularly as we're seeing it happen in children at younger and younger, much younger ages. And so again, how to respond to that. And obviously there's always funding challenges as we get to how we provide that training for teachers and staff, how we provide for more counselors and social workers in our schools. But it's a complex problem that I think has a multifaceted approach in terms of how we solve it.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Bentley Edwards. When we talk about this issue, sometimes it's a little difficult because folks can get defensive, because it sounds like we're saying, so are you saying that the teachers, administrators are racist, that they're picking on the students because they're black? How do we confront that?
I think first we have to look at structural racism. And where it comes into structural racism is when you see these disparities, so that if your practices have a disparate impact, and you do nothing about it, then that's where you're supporting some institutional racism and structural racism, because the system is having these, you can see in the system that there are differences in how the disciplinary practices are engaged upon depending on the children.
Right.
If you just decide that it is the way it's supposed to be, that is a support of institutional racism. I don't believe all teachers are racist.
Right.
You don't go into this for the money. You
Right.
go in because you really want to help children.
Right.
But sometimes it's scary to think, well, do I have implicit biases that are contributing to these disparities?
And the conversations are hard to have.
They're absolutely
Right? I mean,
difficult
sure,
to have.
sure.
But you know, what's more difficult for these children is to be impacted by the lack of adult conversation around race. And so we need to allow teachers to talk about their concerns, their fears, or even where they just feel helpless
Right.
in working with children that are very different from their own children, as well as the communities in which they live and play and everything else. So I think that needs to be looked at. And also, in part of the cultural competency training that we look at, we have to say, how do you see children as children, right? Do you see them as adults that you're engaging with, or do you see them as children that are responding in developmentally appropriate ways when they challenge
Right.
authorities in the 9th grade?
We're going to take a commercial break, and then we're going to come back. I do want to talk about another cultural training. I want to talk about teacher diversity, sort of solution things, or other discipline practices that I know that Wake County, for example, has been looking at. So we are going to continue this great conversation, but before we go to break, see if you can answer this question. In Wake County Public Schools, 20% of all suspensions involve elementary school students. What is the top reason for their suspension? Welcome back to Education Matters. Did you correctly answer B? Fighting and/or aggression is the top reason for elementary school suspensions in Wake County, followed by class or activity disturbance. We're going to continue our discussion about racial disparities in school discipline. Keith, I want to go back to you. Teacher diversity, and then the idea of, we've been talking about that on this show some, that the fact that most of our teaching workforce are white females, while we're now a minority student population. Is, misunderstanding, lack of cultural awareness, are those things contributing to it? Are those things that we should look at the current teaching workforce and then working toward having a more reflective, representative workforce?
Well, obviously there are, cultural differences that exist. And so certainly cultural awareness training and those things would help when you look at the question that you just raised in terms of the reasons for those suspensions, fighting aggression being at the top of the list. Students often come to school angry, hungry, and not in the best position to be able to learn because of, again, some of the stressors, adverse child experiences that we talked about earlier that they deal with at home on a daily basis. And so, again, ensuring that we have a teaching force that does resemble what our classrooms and schools are looking like, that look like, and that are able to understand and be able to relate to the experiences, trauma, stresses that again, students are dealing with at home and that they then bring to school.
And if they don't look like, at least like I said, the understanding, and you keep going back to the trauma question, because that's what I hear from teachers myself, is that the kids are angry. They're coming to school, they're in situations that's a normal reaction, right?
Well, part of it is that if I have witnessed community violence, you would expect me to respond in some type of way. So if I've witnessed community violence and then I come to school and I'm ready, to learn about Christopher Columbus, for example, I might be a little bit frustrated and angry on multiple levels. The other aspect is oftentimes teachers don't know specifically what trauma children are going through or are not able to make those distinctions. So for instance, community violence would be different than, say, a child in the foster care system. And if you're in the foster care system, you have dealt with some level of trauma. And oftentimes there is not a good communication between the principal, school counselor, and the teachers to know, hey, this student just lost a parent. This student just witnessed something that was horrible. And so sometimes teachers don't understand why a student is fidgety or why they may seem angry. All those things come into place, and instead it's a very behavior-based and immediate behavior-based disciplinary process.
Exclusion, move it out. We want the child out of the classroom because they're disrupting other students.
Absolutely.
That does, and that's, Keith, go ahead.
Well, and when you look at, all that teachers have on their plate in terms of teaching the curriculum, sticking with the standards, there's a lot of pressure on our teachers. And so it's how can we best support them, provide them the necessary supports in the classroom to help address that. While too, they obviously they have to, take the personal responsibility to, as Dr. Edwards said, to, understand and recognizing why a child might be fidgety, why a child might not be paying attention today, or seems to be drifting, or or something of that nature. So, again, there's not one specific.
Well, let me ask you about, how about the school culture and climate? One of the things when the Public School Forum did some study work on race equity, restorative justice practices was something, and we can talk about what that, but basically sort of the opposite of your sort of zero tolerance, command and control. To be honest with you, this conversation around school safety concerns me because it feels like we're talking about making it even more sort of armed. But there are definitely folks who will tell me these kids just need to be they just need to be tightened up, right? We just got to get them in line and zero tolerance and everything be better. But your research shows that actually has the opposite effect.
It has the absolute opposite effects. It's one of those things that makes adults feel better, but it actually doesn't really have positive effects on children, on their learning and their overall outcomes. So when you decide we need to make an example out of a child so that they can know what it's like in the real world. If I'm poor and I'm black, trust me, I know that the world is not fair. So I don't need you and your disciplinary practices that don't think about my context, that don't have any compassion to let me know that the world is not fair or that there's consequences for my actions. So this restorative justice approach is exactly the right direction to go in.
And it's about building relationships, because that's one of the things we understand. Children that are in these situations, they're lacking those relationships, which again, when I think about suspensions, they may be acting out because of a bad situation at home, so what are we going to do? We're going to suspend them and send them back home. Is that something, what's Wake County thinking about as a school board? You're a school board member, policy-wise, other things. What are you thinking about?
We talked a lot about relationships in our meeting last night and understanding the importance of that, particularly when it comes to equity issues, such as this. We had a lot of discussion about a moratorium. Do we put a moratorium on elementary suspensions or K-2 suspensions until we can at least get an understanding or get a grip on what is happening, why is it happening, and what our responses to that might be. We did not make that decision to put a moratorium just yet. That may be one of a number of solutions our staff will bring back to us to consider. But we're going to take 30 days and have our staff look at how we develop a response, both a short-term, immediate response, because we do believe that this is a crisis, and then more long-term impacts from a policy standpoint. But we know that something needs to change, something needs to happen and happen quickly. Again, if that's putting a stop on all suspensions at this point, if it's restorative justice practices, if we're creating alternative learning spaces within the school so that we're not sending kids home, adding more counselors, adding more social workers in the school. All those are things that we are considering in terms of.
And they all cost money. And they all take resources.
Unfortunately, some of them do cost money.
What are your thoughts on sort of next steps? Sort of where do we go for solutions?
Well, actually, before I talk about solutions,
okay.
I did want to quickly just make sure to point out that black girls are also disproportionately disciplined. So we think about males because overall males are higher, but black girls in North Carolina statewide have long-term suspensions that are 5 times higher than their white counterparts.
Okay.
So the disparity is actually larger, even though it's a smaller number. And so talking about thinking about practices that we can put in place for adults to understand that oftentimes when children talk back, it's because they're trying to self-advocate, but they're doing it inappropriately and childlike because they're children.
All right. We only have a moment left. Any last comment on that, Keith?
Well, I think that too is it's important for us to understand what is the impact of suspending kids, particularly at such a younger age. It sort of starts a trajectory where their label is being targets for discipline. They're not in school, they're losing instructional days, and we know what the long-term effects are in terms of their ability to earn income at a later age and attending college rates and being successful.
Well, I'm glad we're focusing on it, and I'm really glad you guys came on and talked to us about it today. We'll continue this conversation on another show. So thanks so much. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
After the break, this week's Leadership Spotlight. Each week, Education Matters spotlights individuals demonstrating exceptional leadership in education in North Carolina based on nominations from you, our viewers. This week, we spotlight Renee Seckel with Save Our Schools, a parent advocate here in Wake County.
Well, I went to a board advisory council meeting, and my school board rep, Bill Fletcher, kind of sounded the alarm about the class size bill. The class size bill had changed the way basically that funding is provided for class sizes and also limited class sizes in grades K through 3. Every art teacher in the state at risk of losing their job with nowhere else to go. That was horrifying to me.
It was extremely personal to many, many of us.
Somebody said, you know what, we should have a Facebook group.
So that people could see what we were up to, what the legislator was up to. Many special needs kids are in separate classrooms, but the one time a day that they join and get integrated is into an art class or a phys ed class. So I think it's very important that we have that integration, and to lose that would be an incredible, tragedy.
I think it all comes down to funding. And I hate to say it that way because it always sounds like you're just saying money, money, money. But if you were funding our schools completely, you don't have to worry about whether or not there's an art teacher next year. You have the funding already. The parents of the state really have stepped up and need to continue stepping up and let our General Assembly know that we care about what happens not just to our kids, but to every other kid in the state.
We're going to keep fighting. HB 90 is not the cure-all for class size, and so we have lots of things to get done still to make sure that we have an equal opportunity public education system in North Carolina.
If you know someone that deserves to be recognized, visit our website, ncforum.org, click on Education Matters, and you'll find a link to nominate someone in your community. After the break, this week's final word. This isn't the first episode we've talked about issues of race in education, and it won't be the last. I know these conversations can be challenging and at times uncomfortable. That's okay. I know there are some who think that we as a society already talk about race too much and that just discussing it creates problems. I personally think the opposite is true. These are conversations that need to be had, that we have largely avoided. And then, more importantly, actions that need to take place. Now, today we discussed discipline disparity in our public schools, how African American students get suspended far more frequently than their white classmates, often for the same offense. The data is completely clear, not just here in North Carolina, but in districts all across the country. What we need to be asking our question is, we've studied this at the Public School Forum around race equity in education. Why are students of color less likely to be placed in advanced rigorous courses when their standardized test scores are the same? Why are they more likely to be identified as having a learning disability? Why does our teaching workforce look less and less like the students they teach? We didn't have all the answers today, but it's important to keep working at it until we do, and ask the larger questions too about the role of race in our society, our nation's history, and its continuing impact. All is important if we ever hope to move forward together. That's it for this week's show. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next week for a brand new Education Matters.